Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we're going to dive right into what is honestly one of the most thrilling survival stories in history. We're looking at how a bunch of scattered, completely independent British North American colonies were basically forced to team up. And trust me, they were facing some truly terrifying odds.
I want you to picture this for a second. You're living in a small, quiet town, right? But right next door is a massive, battle-hardened military force that just finished fighting a huge war. They've got the weapons, they've got thousands of soldiers, and you, well, you don't. So how do you protect yourself? That wasn't just a hypothetical question. That was the terrifying, very real reality for the people living in British North America back in the 1860s.
So, here's our threat matrix for today. 1. A divided land. 2. The giant next door. 3. Attack of the Fenians. 4. Money troubles and defense. And finally, 5. The push for Confederation. Let's get into it.
Starting with number 1, a divided land.
Geographically speaking, British North America was absolutely huge. We're talking a massive amount of territory. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. These colonies operated totally independently of one another. It was kind of like having a bunch of separate little countries. They had their own local governments, and they made their own rules. Now, if you are a giant disconnected territory without a unified defense team, well, you are an incredibly easy target for an invasion.
That brings us to number 2, the giant next door.
To really understand the threat coming from the United States, we have to unpack a very specific idea they had at the time. It was called manifest destiny. Simply put, this was the American belief that they had a clear, undeniable right and even a duty to expand and take over all of North America, the whole shebang. They were already pushing west, taking over lands, and a lot of folks in the British colonies were terrified that they'd set their sights up north next.
And this anxiety, it builds into a full-blown crisis pretty fast. From 1861 to 1865, the United States fought a massive civil war. When the northern states won, they were left with a very large, incredibly well-trained army that suddenly had no battles left to fight. The danger escalated so quickly. In 1866, an annexation bill was actually introduced in the U.S. And then, by 1867, the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. So suddenly, the British colonies were feeling seriously squeezed from multiple sides.
We really need to pause on that 1866 annexation bill because the stakes were astronomically high. Annexation basically means taking over another territory and making it part of your own. An actual Massachusetts congressman named Nathaniel Banks introduced a bill to Congress that literally called for Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the Canadas to be admitted as states of the United States of America. No joke. If that passed, it meant the absolute total takeover of British North America.
Moving to number 3, Attack of the Fenians.
Enter the Fenians. Who were they? Well, the Fenians were a secret Irish Catholic organization operating in both Ireland and the U.S. They absolutely hated British rule over Ireland and wanted their independence. But how do you fight Britain all the way from North America? Their answer was to turn to violence and attack Britain's poorly defended colonies. Their wild, kind of unbelievable plan was to literally take the British North American colonies hostage until Britain finally gave Ireland its independence.
The contrast in attitudes at the time is just wild. On one hand, you had American political cartoons showing characters running and shouting about how they were just going to take Canada. People were actually joking about taking over the colonies. But for the colonists, like the local militia forming up in Orangeville, Ontario, this was absolutely no joke. These were regular citizens, volunteer soldiers, getting ready to defend their own homes from actual Fenian invaders. It was a life-or-death situation. In fact, 10 colonial soldiers, many of them just college students with barely any training, were actually killed during a battle in Ridgeway.
The really frustrating part for the colonists was that the Fenians were attacking from the United States, and it felt like the U.S. government was doing basically nothing to stop them. There's this fascinating letter from a young militia soldier named Alexander James Christie, written in 1866. He wrote that Canadians were entirely convinced the American authorities weren't even trying to keep the peace. He said they were scarcely astonished that the Fenians slipped right past the Americans. You can feel the tension, right? There was a deep, deep distrust growing between these neighbors.
Which leads us to number 4, money troubles and defense. Now, all this defense is going to cost some serious money. In 1862 alone, Britain sent over 10,000 troops across the ocean to help protect the colonies. But think about the harsh winters up there. The St. Lawrence River would literally freeze solid, meaning ships couldn't get through. So these soldiers had to march massive, grueling distances through freezing, unforgiving winter terrain in New Brunswick just to reach their posts. Britain quickly realized that protecting these massive, scattered colonies by land was becoming way too difficult and, honestly, way too expensive.
Add an absolute economic nightmare on top of those defense costs. The United States canceled something called the Reciprocity Treaty. Basically, this was a massive tax break the colonies relied on for trading with the U.S. So overnight, they lost their biggest trading partner. Ouch. But a politician named George Brown came up with a brilliant team-up solution. He argued that if they united all the provinces together, they'd instantly create a combined market of 4 million people. The East can send fish and coal, the West could send flour and meats. His logic was simple. If the U.S. won't trade with us, we'll just trade with each other.
And that brings us to our final point, number 5, the push for Confederation. So you have the threat of an American takeover, actual armed Fenian raids, a completely exhausted British military, and a shattered economy. Politicians finally realized that remaining separate meant they were either going to be picked off one by one or just go totally broke. Listen to this powerful vision from Thomas D'Arcy McGee back in 1860. He said, "I see in the not remote distance one great nationality, all bound together by free institutions and free commerce." He wanted to take these scared, isolated, separate colonies and turn them into one powerful, free, united nation that could actually stand on its own 2 feet.
Confederation wasn't just a political idea. It was the ultimate survival tactic. It was the perfect team-up that literally solved every single problem on their threat matrix. By joining together, they could pool their resources and their military strength. They could form a united front to defend against that American idea of manifest destiny. They could finally repel those violent Fenian raids. They could fix their broken economy by trading with one another in a massive new internal market. And, maybe most importantly for Britain, they could finally take that heavy burden of defense off the British government's shoulders.
We've talked about the threats, the battles, and these brilliant, desperate solutions. Confederation really wasn't just a bunch of politicians in fancy suits writing laws in a room. It was an urgent, do-or-die matter of survival against a giant army next door and armed raiders at the border. So I want to leave you with this provocative question to chew on. If these separate colonies hadn't teamed up to face these massive threats together, would they have ever survived to become the country we know today? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep asking great questions.